Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm Tom, and you can't hear it, but I just popped a bottle of champagne.
And this is our New Year's Minisode.
First of all, we want to thank everyone for staying with us throughout the holiday break. By the time you hear this, our Christmas minisode will be out. Please give us your thoughts. Please give us your comments on whether or not you like it or whether or not you want us to do more of these minisodes. And also send us ideas, send us comments, send us your thoughts on what we talk about. We want to hear it. We want to integrate it into our podcast going forward.
So, we definitely want to hear from you guys. We want to hear your suggestions for episodes. Next full episode that we're going to do that's coming out on January 10th is going to be our first listener request. So we've gotten a couple of requests in for different ideas, and we're really open to anything. So anything you guys want to know about, we're interested in researching and talking about. So definitely send those in to the tellmeaboutpodcast@gmail.com.
And with that, let's get into talking about New Year's. And I don't know, Laura, if this was it for you, but when I was a kid, New Year's was weird.
What do you mean weird?
Well, because you're coming off of Christmas, and then you have these like 4 or 5 days of build up to New Year's, and then literally inside of a minute, it's over. And it also just meant that you were going back to school. Then you were going back to school the next day.
Yeah, no, I get that from that perspective. Yeah. And the time between Christmas and New Year's is always just this weird kind of like time warp. And it's like you don't know what day it is, like you don't know what's going on. So it's just, yeah, it's just this weird time frame. The joy of Christmas is over, and you're just kind of in this like weird space before the next like holiday. But yeah, no, I get it.
And then once it was like 12:05 on New Year's Day, it's okay. Well, now it's over. Now what?
Now what do we do?
Now what do we do? Now it's just January, and we live in the north. Now it's just cold and gray, and it's dark at 4:30.
Now, see, we're gaining light again. To me, and I think I saw it more like that when I was growing up, but to me, like January, and we'll get into it a little bit, January kind of signifies to me like just a new opportunity and almost like a rebirth of the year. And to me, I see that we're gaining light again, and it just feels a little bit lighter. So I'm not so much the optimist usually, but for whatever reason around the new year, since I've been an adult, like especially the last like maybe 10 years or so, it always just seems like a renewal to me. And it once we get into January, then I tend to like it, but it is very cold here. Yeah.
It's very cold, and what I can actually, this is a complete aside, and we'll actually get into New Year's in a second. When I get into January, I actually also I love to watch the Australian Tennis Open. And I'll tell you why. Because when it's middle January, and there's usually about 6 inches of dirty snow that's been piled up for about a month and a half that you can barely walk across the street on, and it's like you've had like 10 straight days of 35 degrees with like a 20-degree wind chill, and it's dark at 5 o'clock. It's nice to watch something and see where it's like 95 degrees and sunny and people are wearing shorts.
That's really cool, though. I didn't know that the Australian Open was a thing.
It's one of the big four tennis tournaments, like with Wimbledon. And it's also on, because of the time difference, it's on at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm a night owl, so that's how I spent many a college night and many a law school night watching tennis in January at 3 o'clock in the morning.
So it's become kind of a tradition for you.
For me, yes.
And I just want to say shout out to our Australian listeners while we're talking about it. We've seen some growth for our audience in that country. So, hey guys, thank you.
If you've ever been to the Australian New Year in Sydney, where they shoot fireworks, I think, off the bridge in the Opera House, please tell us about that, because we want to hear about that.
It always looks really beautiful. Whatever channel you're watching, sometimes they do like shots around the world as it's happening. And I always just thought that that Australia's is very beautiful.
It's also one of the first ones.
True. Mm-hmm.
It is one of the first ones to celebrate the new year, and we will talk about that in a second, because we're actually going to talk today about something that is, well, it's not near and dear to me, but it was kind of near to me growing up, and that's the ball drop in Times Square in Manhattan. And let me ask you a question, Laura. Do you want me to start with ball history or ball facts? And this is not a euphemism. This is actually how they're listed on the Times Square website: ball history or ball facts.
Well, let's start with ball history. I like that.
The history of the ball in Times Square. Times Square became a thing in 1904 when the New York Times bought the Times building in Times Square. And it was around that time in 1904 where they did the first New Year's celebration. Now, this did not involve a ball drop per se. That didn't happen until 1907. 1907 was the first time that the ball was dropped from Times Square. And in fact, the first New Year's ball was an iron and wood ball. It was a 700-pound ball, and it had 125-watt light bulbs. So what basically happened was it was a big to-do where people would come out. People, fans, listeners, friends, Laura is trying very hard not to giggle uncontrollably on the audio.
You're saying ball a lot.
Okay. That's what. How would you like me to describe it? The sphere. It's a fucking ball.
Ball is fine. I just have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old sometimes. So go ahead.
Well, now you got me thinking about it.
It's fine.
You might as well just leave all this in.
Couldn't get through the New Year's episode. Why is that? Because we said ball too many times.
So the first sphere drop, we'll call it that, was in 1907. And as the legend goes, that all of the restaurants that were surrounding Times Square at the time, the waiters and other hotel workers were supplied with battery-powered top hats emblazoned with the number 1908, symbolizing the new year. So whenever you've seen some really, really drunk person in Times Square with those 2022 goggles Frenching Jenny McCarthy, it started from a waiter in 1907 wearing a battery pack for a hat.
Good to know.
As the years went on, the celebration grew. It's been lowered every year since, with the exception of 1942 and 1943. Do you want to guess why it was not lowered in those 2 years specifically?
I would assume it had something to do with World War II.
That's exactly correct. The lights would dim in New York City every night in 1942 and 1943 to avoid, I guess, an air raid. And people still found a way to celebrate the new year, but those were the only 2 years that the ball did not drop. Crowds still gathered in Times Square during those years and greeted the new year with a minute of silence, followed by the ringing of chimes from sound trucks parked at the base of the tower, which was a callback to when Trinity Church in Manhattan used to basically ring in the new year by ringing the bells.
Is that where that started?
That's where that started. Now, the idea of the spherical descent to mark time is actually not new. It was reverse engineered. There were actually reports that as early as the 1800s, a ball descending from a pole was used by ships as a way to tell time. So, like, for example, in England, there was actually a globe placed on top of a flagpole that would descend, and when it reached the bottom, that's how ship captains knew it was 12 o'clock. This was kind of reverse engineered from that, or retrofitted, however you want to describe it. In 1920, they actually replaced the original globe with a one made entirely of wrought iron. That was then replaced again in 1955 by an aluminum ball, which was only a mere 150 pounds. So we actually had a aerodynamic and lighter, faster ball. And this ball actually stayed until the 1980s when they changed the ball again. That time they made it an apple. It was an apple and a heart, and it was in part with the famous I Love New York travel campaign.
That makes sense.
That stayed until the late 80s, until I believe 1988 or 89 when it went back to the aluminum globe. Also, it was during this time where the aluminum globe also had lights on it. In 1995, it was the skin was upgraded to aluminum. They added more lights. The globe took on its normal bright white appearance with the aluminum triangular panels and the light bulbs sticking out of the side. The one I remember was it was bright white. It had those triangular panels, like hexagonal panels. It kind of looked a little bit like a smaller, smoother version of the Spaceship Earth sphere at Epcot. Obviously, a much different, but it kind of looked a little similar to that. It was upgraded again in the mid 2000s, where they added LED lights. The technology was upgraded. Also, did you know it did not stay on the Times building the entire year?
Where did it go?
It was stored and it would be put up around in December, around New Year's. It was not until 2009 that it was installed permanently. All year round, it's now there, permanently there. It's now in its current iteration, and I believe the former globe is actually now at street level at the visitor center, where you can actually go and see the previous version of it before it was upgraded. It was also in the late 40s, or in the mid to late 40s, that networks started to broadcast the drop from Times Square. Many networks have telecast from Times Square. There is one that is synonymous, but it was not the first one. It was actually NBC was actually the first one to broadcast on both TV and radio, to broadcast the drop from Times Square on New Year's Eve. In later years, NBC continued to maintain their coverage. It was actually built into The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. They would have a special version. It wasn't until 1972 when the show that would become synonymous with Times Square on New Year's Eve first debuted, and that was Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve. Dick Clark, who was, if you're too young to remember, also hosted American Bandstand. He did a lot of him and his companies produced a lot of shows. But he became synonymous with New Year's Eve and ABC. He broadcast every year from 1972 until he passed away in 2012.
I remember Dick Clark's Rockin' Eve is like such a big part of my childhood growing up, especially when I was younger. We would always, turn that one on, and he was just very present. Like, I just remember that was the channel you went into. That's what you watched, at least when I was a kid.
That was us too. And the only year he didn't host it was 2004, 2005, after he had his very public stroke. That year, Regis Philbin filled in for him. Ask your parents about Regis Philbin. He was a very little man who hosted a show in New York and yelled about Notre Dame football a lot.
A lot.
A lot. A lot. And David Letterman used to have him on to make fun of him. It also became tradition at New Year's Eve, at Dick Clark's New Year's Eve, that dignitaries, celebrities, kind of important people would be the ones to push the button to start the drop at 11:59. One of them I remember was, I think it was my last New Year's Eve in New York. The city had taken the opportunity. This was, of course, the first one after 9/11. It was 3 months after 9/11, and the city wanted to show that it was safe to go to New Year's Eve. Because at that point, people were worried about going to public gatherings and being in crowded spaces, and anthrax. Remember, anthrax on envelopes was a thing that people were legitimately scared for. So the city and its mayor, you may have heard of him, wanted to show that it was safe. He also took the opportunity to officially swear in the next mayor of New York City at the time, In fact, I believe, if I remember correctly, either the mayoral vote or I think it was the mayoral primary was supposed to happen on 9/11, or it was either the primary or the debate, but it was supposed to happen on 9/11, and obviously it did not. I think it was a debate. It was supposed to be a televised debate.
Let me ask you, and again, you may not know, but that year, was there any discussion that they were going to cancel the Times Square celebration because it might have been a little bit too risky or people didn't want to go? I remember it being a lighter crowd, if I'm remembering that correctly, but like, was there any discussion of them canceling it at all?
I don't know if it was ever discussed. I know the city wanted to kind of make a show of strength in terms of like tourism. I mean, this is one of the city's kind of signature events, along with like the marathon and Fleet Week and things like that. So, and the 4th of July fireworks on the Hudson. So the city wanted to show that it was okay to go to things again. So security was extra. I remember going places for like those last 11 months that I lived there, that we lived there, and everything was locked down super tight. I remember I was at an Islander game like January of '02. They were literally patting people down and wanting people and going through like full body scanners or something like that. And all that was because the Governor Pataki, was supposed to make an appearance there. And that was a game that only had 15,000 people, and there's only a very in an arena. There's only a very limited ways the public can get in and out. But when you're in Times Square, it's not like a controlled festival. You're pouring in and out of side streets. So there's like 25 different ways to get there, not to mention all the people flooding in and out from the subway.
We talked about it a little bit before we started recording, and this is my literal nightmare. Like, I know I've talked a lot on this podcast about how I have some anxiety about certain things, and being in crowds is one of them. I've thought about going to Times Square over the years, definitely when I was younger, like early 20s, but even back then, it just, for me, it would not be a good idea.
I had absolutely no desire to go. My family, we never went. We had no desire to go. Even now, like it was one of the things when I would move around and people would hear where I'm from, they would always ask, "Oh, did you go? Did you go up this Empire State Building? Did you go up the Statue of Liberty? Did you do this? Did you do that? Did you go to Times Square?" And if you're living from there, especially if you're like a native New Yorker, you're from there, that's really not, you're not going into Manhattan unless you have to, or unless you have a reason. You're not going just to go up the Empire State Building. It was something you did like as a field trip if your school was going. That was more for like, I hate to say the tourists because that sounds super snobby, but a lot of the people that are going are tourists.
I was going to say, it always felt like a very touristy thing to do.
It is. All those things are touristy things to do.
Statue of Liberty is cool, though. I have been there, and that is very neat.
And I've been up the Empire State Building once, and it was cool. But I'm like, it was one of the things. Okay, I did it once. It was interesting. So I think there was talk about funneling everyone in and out of one exit and one entrance, so that everyone had to come in and out of one place.
That sounds like a safety nightmare, though.
It is, and the only reason why I seem to remember that is I remember living in Boston after the marathon bombing, and that's a whole other story about how surreal that week was. But I remember being there that summer, and I'd met a few of my friends to go to the fireworks display for 4th of July. In Boston, that's also a big deal too because that's on the water. There is where they have the turtle shell concert venue for the Boston Pops, and the Pops usually have a live concert on New Year's Eve, and a lot of people are sitting on the grass there as they shoot the fireworks off over the Charles. And it was the same thing where there's only like one place you can actually go in, and there was only one place you can go out. So that was what I immediately thought of. I remember it was lighter, but it was not. It wasn't like it was the COVID year. I mean, it's lighter compared to like 100,000 people packed onto a sidewalk with no bathroom.
That was my other thing. Like, where are you going to pee?
You basically have to go into a restaurant and buy something. you also have to go with about 8 or 9 people that can basically save a spot for you.
And I think, come on, you're drinking. Like, once you break that seal, like, you're peeing every 20 minutes. So I don't get how that works.
Maybe they have portable toilets there. I don't know. If you've ever been to Times Square, tell us. Do they have portable toilets? I don't think they do. Every year, New Year's Eve has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I have a ton of anxiety now seeing all those people squeezed in like sardines, waiting for literally 60 seconds of a ball dropping, and then it's over.
I think it always seemed more appealing to me to stay home where it was warm and, and you could have food and drinks and a bathroom.
I mean, I've also gotten to the age now where we will watch like the last 2 minutes, and then we'll watch like the first couple minutes after, and then it becomes very, very exhausting to have to explain to my family who all the musical acts are. Other thing I want to mention too about New Year's, the only other time they didn't do Dick Clark's Rocking Eve was for the year 2000. And instead what happened was they hosted basically a 24-hour ABC celebration that was actually anchored by Peter Jennings, showing the New Year's around the world. This is actually the first time I saw the fireworks shooting off the suspension bridge, the arch bridge, and coming from out of the opera house. What they actually did was, instead of having Dick Clark's regular show, he co-hosted the last hour with Peter Jennings. And if you're old enough to remember Peter Jennings was the definition of a newsman's newsman.
Mm-hmm.
The very serious, very, very buttoned up, very serious, very stern gravitas in the voice coming from all those cigarettes he smoked. Talk about just a clash. Peter Jennings and Dick Clark hosting a New Year's Eve.
I imagine that was a weird pairing.
Do you have any memories of New Year's Eve? Because I was never really one to go out.
It's never been a huge thing for me. I think I've always felt and saw that Christmas was bigger, and Christmas was obviously the more important holiday. I think growing up we used to get together with friends. Like I remember just hanging out at friends' houses, sleepovers, stuff like that when I, was a teenager, maybe had some alcohol there too. Yeah, so nothing crazy. The only thing I will tell you, and I won't go into all the details, but for the year 2000 when it switched over, we had a little bit of a family emergency that year. My brother had injured himself and needed me to drive him to the hospital. So I did, and I was 14 years old without a license, never really having driven before, and was able to get him there, and he's fine. It was nothing major, but it was just a kind of something that kind of like rocked our worlds, that year. So that's something I very much remember happening. That's how we kind of rung in the new century, I guess. So that's the biggest. There was a year, I think, when I was a little younger, that we went down to the city, down to Penn's Landing in Philadelphia, and watched the fireworks there. But other than that, no, I just like to kind of stay in, maybe hang out with a few friends. It's just I like a more low key. I think for me, like I said in the beginning, I like to kind of like reflect on the past year and things that I kind of want for my life and the next year, and do a lot of reflection that way. And I kind of think about what I want and the direction that, I want my life to go, or at least try to steer it in that direction the following year. So I see it as very much like a time of renewal rather than just celebrating like one day. You know what I mean?
And I'm kind of the same way. Like, I was never interested in going out and partying and things like that because I was never really into like the bars or dance clubs or anything like that. So it was always just kind of spent with family and friends, just hanging out, turning the Times Square on in the last maybe 2 or 3 minutes to watch it. That was just kind of it. And Times Square is kind of unique because there's really nowhere else in the country that really does what Times Square does. Every city has their own little, they'll shoot off fireworks and things like that. I think in Seattle, I think they do something with the Space Needle. I know in Toronto they fire fireworks off the CN Tower, which looks really cool. But Times Square is kind of unique, and it's even when I lived in the Central Time Zone, I guess it was always kind of my connection to home. We didn't, I guess, observe the official New Year in the Central Time Zone. We always just followed whatever happened in New York.
That can launch me into a whole nother discussion about time zones and how I feel like people on the East Coast, we get a little, I feel like there's this like time zone arrogance where like we forget about mountain time and Pacific time, and we kind of think it happens to us first, so that's the most important thing. Do you get that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. First of all, Pacific Time Zone is the absolute best time zone for sports watching because everything's done by like 8, 9 o'clock. Central Time Zone, I think, is like the sweet spot of time zones because it's only an hour behind and you're still in the middle of everything. Also, don't get me started on daylight savings time.
I would like to do an episode around when we switch back in March about it, so stay tuned for that. I have a lot of feelings about it.
And it gets really confusing because there are individual cities and places that don't observe it.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets spicy. But we want to know, again, what your New Year's traditions are. If there's anything you do special for New Year's, email us, hit us up on social media. We want to hear from you. And again, we want your input. We do this for you guys. So if you have suggestions for episodes, if you have suggestions for topics, if you just want to tell us we're great, or if you want to tell us we suck, all interaction is good interaction.
I mean, I'd prefer if you don't tell us that we suck. That would be better, but
But it means you're listening. So, but we appreciate you guys. We wish you the happiest and healthiest of New Year's. Again, we know this is a hard time for a lot of people. Love to you all. And we are very, very excited about 2024 and some of the things we're going to do. So stay with us.
I feel like 2024 is going to be a good year. And I want to say, too, don't put too much pressure on yourself for these New Year's resolutions. I mean, most people give up on them, and I just think it's like we're setting ourselves up for failure. So, yeah. So go easy on yourselves.
Absolutely. So we will be back on January 10th.
Please go over to our socials, Instagram and TikTok at the Tell Me About Podcast, and send us comments, questions, and episode suggestions to the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com. We'll be back with our next full episode on January 10th, and I am going to cover the escape from Alcatraz. Happy New Year, everybody.
See you in January, everybody.